Greetings. My name is Joshua Binus, and I'm the Industry Foresight Lead within the Corporate Strategy Organization at the Bonneville Power Administration. The following presentation is part 4 of a 7-part video series focused on exploring the long-term electric power industry landscape. If you haven't already, please take a few minutes to view the introduction to the series for some valuable context. Hopefully, you'll find the time spent viewing this video to be valuable. Please feel free to send me an email with any feedback. Enjoy. Electricity services will become more distributed and less centralized. And, this is an area of the industry landscape that's kind of old hat for a lot of folks already, but I've got to go through this because for some folks in different parts of the business, it's not necessarily. One of the things that we've already been noticing for several years now is this trend of the grid is moving from a point of being a very centralized power system, one that's very distributed. And when we look at, the way that things have been done for the last century, power is generated in large central facilities like a big dam or nuke plant, coal plant, gas plant, sent one way through the transmission system into the distribution system, into different neighborhood feeders, and then all the way to the home. And those homeowners have been basically captive or passive end-use consumers of that electricity. Now, what's been happening over time is that we're watching that system evolve through the addition of distributed generation, distributed storage, and some energy management capability, here in this image referred to as smart load, added at all levels of the system, whether it's at the transmission level, the distribution level, or down at the local level. And that's having this impact of, number one, creating two-way power flows throughout the system, not just power, but also data. And it's also, as the distributed energy resources are getting added behind the meter at the end-use facility, it's enabling them to actually produce power to feed into the grid from the opposite end. And so we've got these what once were very passive or captive end-use consumers becoming prosumers of power as well. And as this ecosystem continues to evolve, we see portions of it also getting the capability to island themselves during periods of grid disturbance or blackout, where they can island themselves and maintain their function through a microgrid development. Now, within the microgrid, there's a defining characteristic that they have the ability to share power within the microgrid because of the presence of some combination of distributed generation, energy management, and often distributed storage that enables different parts of the microgrid to exchange power back and forth. The microgrids themselves have been evolving over time. So original microgrids, the first out of the gate, were typically microgrids of like a large facility, maybe a hospital. And there were different portions of the hospital that would communicate with each other to maintain the reliability of that specific end-use facility. Over time, the microgrid got to be larger, so it would cover an entire hospital campus or an educational campus. And then it continued to expand to include multiple parties spread across a wider geography that could participate in the microgrid as well. And when we look at the microgrids that have been deployed across the United States, we're seeing more and more of them out there. Of course, a lot of the first microgrids were developed in the Northeast on the heels of Superstorm Sandy because, after that storm hit, a lot of the diesel generators started running out of fuel within a week, and they are very difficult to keep refueled. But there were some microgrids that were in place that did very well. Politicians took note of that. Policymakers took note of that across the board. And it ended up unleashing millions of dollars for additional microgrid development as different politicians and communities realized there are a lot of benefits to making their communities more resilient in the face of these destabilizing effects like large storms or grid outages. And among the parties that have been spending heavily on microgrid development is the U.S. military. And, one of the key factors for our military investing in a microgrid development is just, frankly, just to save soldiers' lives and protect our infrastructure. When you look at how many soldiers' lives have been lost in order to transport liquid fuels out to remote locations during wartime, it's a lot of the lives lost of the U.S. military. They want to make those remote locations much more resilient, and by relying on renewable energy and reducing the supply chain infrastructure associated with keeping liquid fuel generators moving and operable. And they also have a lot of coastal installations that they're concerned about maintaining the reliability on. And so we see a lot of investment by the military and across the board. So we're seeing municipal investments, we're seeing investments on islands, and you've got companies like Tesla who are doing very well selling systems to islands, and commercial and community universities all over the place. And really what we see is this kind of repeating cycle of major storm event, press hits about, how good these microgrids are doing. It tends to release more attention and more funding to continue developing microgrids to harden communities and make them more resilient. And so we're seeing more and more constantly, even as they continue to evolve. And, one of the things that is driving the evolution of this decentralization of the grid is the advancement of distributed energy resources across the board. Now, some labs like Pacific Northwest National Lab, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, for example, and parties like Bonneville who have been working on making a transactive energy economy kind of our future, or that's what technologists would refer to it as. I think lay people would just kind of call it the shared energy economy. And we've been working on this for over a decade in different ways. And so this is a visual that was put together by some of those folks who participate in those studies. And, you can't fault them for kind of looking at the future integration of DERs and the development toward transactive energy futures as this kind of incremental flow, because that's how things have gone. There are folks that look at this, though, and get concerned that these 3 stages of DER adoption and the impacts that they have in enabling a transactive energy future could all actually be collapsed down into a single stage because of the way that technology keeps pushing forward. And in particular, here, an example of a technology that could have a destabilizing impact on this assumption of a longer gradual path toward transactive systems is the development of blockchain technology. And blockchain technology came out of the finance industry as a way to start removing middlemen from transactions, so you didn't have to have a third party verify a transaction, that it could happen in more real time and help reduce the cost of financial transactions. And essentially, this is the technology that sits behind cyber currencies like Bitcoin. And what it is basically just distributed ledgering. And all the parties to a blockchain system all have copies of the same exact ledger in that system. And if 2 parties within that system conduct a transaction in their block, on their blockchain, it records who is transacting with whom, what were they transacting, what was the cost of the transaction, and when did it happen. And once that transaction is made, it shows up in everybody's blocks on the blockchain simultaneously. In that way, it's harder to cheat if someone starts messing with it. It has to be acknowledged by the rest of the blockchain as well. This may sound a little bit complicated, and it is. But, the key thing here is this is one of those advances in the digitization of all industries, not just the energy industry. But it is hitting the energy industry at the same time that all these other advances in digitization are as well. And so folks are looking for different ways that they can take advantage of blockchains to make their operations more efficient, cheaper, so they can keep their rates as low as possible. And so there's around the world right now, there's at least 24 pilots. These are identified by Indigo. On their website, it has an interactive site. You can click on these and learn about each one. I've seen some estimations of as high as 50 different pilots around the world looking at using blockchains for the energy industry. And these range from blockchains used within a single facility where appliances are talking to themselves and transacting among themselves for more efficient operations of the facility, to neighborhood scale where end-use consumers are trading power back and forth, like the microgrid that's been developed in Brooklyn, New York under this, or even at a larger scale where like in Europe, they're testing out a pilot for wholesale energy trading that's based on blockchains. And this is an area that we've got to keep an eye on. There may be efficiencies that utilities can use in their supply chain to cut out middlemen. So it's not just about, the transaction of electrons and dollars. It could infuse into other parts of businesses as well. Just a key thing here, just for context to think about is, like I said, this is part of the wave of digitization that's hitting our industry. And I think the impact of blockchains really shouldn't be understated too much, but it's important to be put in context too. There is a hype cycle associated with it, but the promise of it is potentially quite large. Some of the folks that are closest to this kind of refer to blockchains being kind of where the internet was in around 1995 and 96, with all the promises that people are espousing about what the internet could do. And then, now we've actually seen that for a couple decades. Blockchains could be very similar, but blockchains aren't the only thing that's a new way of doing business in this distributed energy economy. You've got other companies that are doing some significant product innovation. And here I'll just hold up an example from Sonnen, formerly Sonnen Battery out of Germany. And they're very active, especially in Germany and Austria and Australia. And, in Australia recently, they've opened up a product offering they call Sonnenflat. They've got 3 different packages for it. And basically the idea is you pay a monthly fee of $30, $40, $50 a month for a solar plus storage system of various sizes. You pay a flat fee per month and they take care of all your energy needs. Their quid pro quo is that they want to have access to your battery so they can aggregate all of those batteries and sell ancillary services into the wholesale market. So they've been doing this already in Germany for a while in a slightly different way to basically maintain a virtual power plant in Germany. They're looking to get that going in Australia, and they've also gotten very active in the United States now. We're seeing more activity where they just secured a deal with a new housing construction developer in Arizona, where they're looking to add solar plus storage systems into about 2,900 new homes, offering about 23 megawatt hours of energy storage capacity connected to rooftop solar PV. Their goal is to have that community self-supply about 80% of its own power and then source the remaining 20% from off-peak priced power from 2 to 5 a.m. in the morning. They're getting really tired of piloting everything. They just want to start getting megawatts out there. So now that they've opened up a headquarters in Atlanta, we're expecting to see more activity from Sonnen in the U.S. market. They're not the only innovator out there in this space. I just raise them up as an example of some different business models that we're seeing start to evolve. Of course, as the distributed energy is kind of moving more and more into the mainstream, we're seeing, homes becoming much more controllable. This is just an example of all the different parts of a home and a smart home where they're demand response ready, they're EV charging ready, they've got some solar on them, potentially some storage. This is a snapshot of a Honda Home app where anytime on your phone you could look to see how well your house is producing, what it's feeding into the grid, how much solar it's generating, what your consumption levels or charging levels are looking like. And granted, most people are not going to want to be microcontrollers of their nanogrid of their home or facility. Most people don't want to be energy experts. So I think a small amount of people are going to want to get really excited about all the control that they can have over it. Most people are going to want some kind of automated agent within their home that's going to do it autonomously, so they don't even have to think about it beyond just setting a couple preference settings at the beginning. Now, you can't talk about distributed energy unless you spend a little bit of time talking about solar. So let's talk about solar PV a little bit. A lot of this I'm going to show you is coming from Green Tech Media, who spends a lot of time looking at this stuff. Here, this is one of their views of rooftop solar markets in 2016, where we saw, actually, here, I'll just stop for a second. Keep in mind, this is not a utility perspective of looking at this. This is more of like how the solar industry looks at markets. They want to enter into states where they can offer end-use customers 10% greater savings in year one in those investments. So the darkest states that you see here, like California, Arizona, New Mexico, New Jersey, these are states in 2016 where they're really viable solar markets. I crossed out Nevada because of activity that happened in Nevada at the end of 2015, where they got rid of some of their net metering policy that supported solar PV. Now that's back on the books now, but that's for 2016. The solar industry pretty much fled Nevada. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. There were new markets opening in 2016. As of last year, rooftop solar markets were expected to continue to expand into 2019. There's some countervailing forces that are afoot right now, but I think the general gist of it is that this is actually fairly close to what we've been seeing. The cost of solar systems keeps dropping. And again, this is for rooftops, not utility scale, and it's opening up more markets. We're seeing a lot more activity. It's starting to branch into the American Southeast and the Midwest. When we look at utility scale view, you can see that that's even much more expansive. Typically, utility scale installations are about 40% cheaper than rooftop systems, so no surprise that you could see a more viable market at the utility scale. In the Northwest, the utility scale market's largely driven from PURPA contracts. That's the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act of 1978. And, basically that's an act that was passed specifically to reduce the monopsony power of electric utilities who at the time were the only, if they chose not to buy the output of a generator, then that generator did not have access to the market. So PURPA was basically required those electric utilities to purchase their output if a local renewable resource was sited within their territory and could offer electricity at a competitive price. In the Northwest, what we've seen is a lot of activity against those PURPA contracts, mostly from companies like PacifiCorp and PGE, maybe Idaho Power, where they wanted to basically reduce the offerings of those contracts from long-term contracts down to short-term contracts. And in Idaho in 2015, they were successful in getting those contracts down to 2 years. And I don't think we've seen a single PURPA contract out of Idaho since that happened. It's hard to imagine anybody getting financing for a renewable project if they've only got a 2-year offtake agreement. And so, we'll see how that continues to advance. But PURPA didn't really get people too fired up until renewables got much more cost competitive. Now it's becoming a real key issue in some states. Now, going back to the rooftop stuff for a minute, one of the things that is driving the residential market so much, and commercial too, just rooftops in general, are net metering policies. And these are just policies that require, when end-use consumers are spilling energy into the grid, it requires the retail electric utility over them to compensate them, typically starting at retail rates, but more recently there's been efforts to push those down to a wholesale rate of compensation. These are done at state level. There's typically a cap associated with it, so once a certain amount of customers join a net metering program, up to like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5%, it triggers a review of the policy to see if changes have to be made. Retail utilities have gone very actively into those spaces to try to take those renewal opportunities to push compensation rates from retail down to wholesale. And it's seeming a little better in the last year, but for a few years there, it was pretty obvious that the utilities were going very heavy against solar intrusion into their territories. And so, one of the things that we saw happen as utilities threatened the solar industry's business proposition to end-use customers, where they were selling systems to folks under these net metering policies, and folks were expecting to see their system paid off in 5 to 7 years or whatever it was under that policy. As the utilities came out to fight net metering, I think it scared the solar installers to the point where they had to strengthen their business proposition by partnering with battery companies to provide a fallback proposition for self-supply if the net metering rules changed drastically and took away that their original proposition. And so when I look at this, I see a lot of, not all, but a lot of retail utilities are not really playing a long game in this space. It's a bit of knee-jerk reaction against this intrusion into their territories, and it's created a fair amount of conflict between retail utilities and solar installers. And in this space, the retail utilities have not been winning a lot. And even sometimes when they do win, they're still losing. And Nevada is a good example here. In Nevada, they got rid of their net metering policy at the end of 2015, drove the solar industry out of the state in 2016. But that policy change, they did not grandfather in any of the end users who had been part of that the net metering policy prior to that change. And they also put in a fixed fee that would start off, I think, somewhere around like $7 or $7.50 a month in the first year, and over a series of years grow to be around $35 to $37 a month within a matter of 5 to 7 years, I want to say. That really cheesed off a lot of folks in Nevada, so it triggered a class action lawsuit against NV Energy by those people who did not get grandfathered to the old policy. It triggered the creation of a new advocacy organization that launched a ballot measure to defray the monopoly status of the retail utilities in Nevada. It also contributed to NV Energy's largest commercial customers also wanting to exit the grid completely and go out and procure their own renewable energy and diminish the total load of NV Energy quite considerably. And then ultimately what happened in the last year is that net metering is now back on the books in Nevada. NV Energy took an incredible blow from a PR side between them and their customers, and the initiative that was put on the ballot to get rid of the monopoly status of utilities passed overwhelmingly, I think around 75 to 25%. If it passes again in the next general election, it becomes law in the state. So like I said, even when utilities are winning in some of these net metering policy fights, it's ultimately a loss. And so there's this need for retail utilities to play a much longer game. So, I think the argument can be made that it's probably better for a utility to have customers still participating with them in a net metering program than to be pushing them to exit their grid with their own self-sustaining systems. So this is, again, like what I'm saying, where I think a lot of retail utilities are kind of moving into the space in a bit knee-jerkish attitude and creating an environment of antagonism, frankly. Looking at this from a wholesaler's perspective, I'm seeing a lot of acrimony right now, and we'll see if that continues. We keep looking at some of the solar stuff. We're seeing markets continuing to expand, whether that's community choice aggregation, especially in California, advancement of community solar or shared solar arrays where people can basically buy a stake in that solar array. We're seeing quite strong advancement of solar plus storage, especially as storage is getting cheaper and more efficient and solar is getting cheaper and more efficient. And we're seeing corporate offsite agreements also take off. And I'll come back to that in a little bit, but this is just kind of gets to the strengthening of the marketplace in general. In the Northwest, Oregon Solar Energy Industry Association is hoping to see about 4,000 megawatts of solar get added in Oregon over the next 10 years, much less so in Washington, but still a fair amount. And all this is happening even before we even get into seeing solar really infuse its way into the built environment, where you start seeing solar slathered onto buildings of all types. Now, when we look at the cost of solar, the cost has been dropping. This is no secret. People have been talking about this quite a bit now for the last few years. I put a star here on this chart to show kind of where we ended up in 2016. That's the residential market. Commercial market is very similar. Costs are falling. This is where we ended up in 2016. And, as we look at the power purchase agreements that have been taking place, they're trending low and continuing to go lower. This is a snapshot of, kind of breakout of some of the costs associated with the price fall over time, and residential, commercial, and utility scale. And although this is fixed tilt, prior to some of the latest issues associated with some international trade and some other policy things that are happening, what happened is we saw this big bump in 2016 in installations, as a lot of folks were thinking that the federal tax credit was going to go away at the end of 2016. It got extended, and so Green Tech Media was arguing that it basically pulled a lot of the market forward from 2017, and we could expect a dip over the next couple years, 2 or 3 years, as everybody kind of dealt with what was in their pipelines, as they were kind of full up at the moment. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out, because of the extreme price falls that happened in 2016, especially with solar modules in particular, from crystalline silicon modules. Most of those are coming out of China. And so there was a Chinese majority owned manufacturer in Georgia that filed for some trade action against the Chinese, and they're asking for some help. And basically that went through about a month or so ago. The Trade Commission decided that there has been evidence of harm on American manufacturers of solar PV panels. And again, these are crystalline silicon panels, and I'm not talking about thin film. And now that has to go to President Trump to make a decision about what the remedy is going to be. And some projections of the impact, again, from Green Tech on what the impact is going to be here, is they're seeing the potential for a significant drop in activity as prices are probably pushed up again to the point where solar modules were probably sometime between like 2012 and 2013, somewhere in there. This is their price forecast for single-axis systems. Those are the utility scale systems where they can follow the sun from morning to evening on a pivot. In the Northwest, just about all the utility scale solar systems we're seeing put in are coming in on a single axis system. So that's why I grabbed this and threw it in so you could see that. But it's really, it's anyone's guess what's going to happen at this point, but some trade action is coming. When we look at storage, this is getting a little old in regard to data. So keep that in mind. I think this might be from 2014. But, basically it's still helpful to see that a lot of the original applications for storage were in the PJM area when they put out, some approval for using battery storage to supply ancillary services in that market. It filled the need fairly quickly, and then they had to start waving people off. But now, the biggest pipeline is in California, obviously, and everybody's watching to see what's going to happen as we see more and more storage hit the grid in California. The prices on the lithium-ion battery packs have been following, just this rapid pace where, the prices that people projected for 2020 already got hit in 2015. And I think since the time that this snapshot was taken in April of 2015, I think the prices have fallen about another 70% since then. So they keep trending lower. You can look at different technologies and how they're faring in comparison to each other here. And this is actually organized by what's in electric vehicle space being used for transport, what's being used for stationary, and then we've got some other portable batteries in here as well. Now, we're watching the price fall in all these, and what folks like Green Tech are telling us is that as we see more batteries getting sold into the marketplace, over time we can expect to see more demand side solutions being employed so that it's not just a utility scale driven market. The market for these, they're expecting to continue to increase over time, and it's a pretty strong market development. And, one of the things that's behind that is the price fall, of course, but behind the price fall is that, there's this battery production boom that we're just watching the early stages of right now with Tesla's advancement of their gigafactory in Nevada, but BYD is building out in China. And there's a lot of manufacturers that are really scaling up their manufacturing capacity in a big way to meet the electric vehicle adoption curve that they're projecting. All of these batteries are not going to go in the cars. A lot of them are going to be sold stationary. But basically, as the manufacturing scale up hits in this technology, it's going to drive the price lower. We're also expecting to see a lot of renewable storage hybrid systems, whether it's wind plus storage, solar plus storage, etc., going in. And we already are seeing that. We're going to see more of it. As far as what happens to the used batteries coming out of the electric vehicles, there's a divergence of opinion on what this is going to look like. You got companies like Tesla on one side of the spectrum who have been telling everybody that, they've looked at reselling used batteries. It doesn't make sense to them. They'd rather recycle those batteries 100%, and they've set up their gigafactory in Nevada to do that. So they could take all that lithium back out and some of the other materials in them like cobalt and reuse them in other batteries. Other companies like Nissan and Mercedes are wanting to sell their batteries secondhand into a marketplace where they become stationary systems, probably behind the meter. Now, associated with all this battery, news, I think one of the creeper advancements that happened over this last year in particular was the announcement of a polymer that can enable solid-state batteries. And there's a lot of folks that are working on creating solid-state batteries, not the only one. But Ionic has really put out a pretty good solution that can enable solid-state lithium-ion batteries, but also solid-state alkaline batteries, which we've never had alkaline batteries that could be recharged, that the electrolytes cause too much damage inside those batteries. But if they could have a solid state electrolyte, then they become much more stable. And alkaline batteries are cheaper to produce, and they don't use as much rare earth materials as lithium ion, for example. And so we could start to see much more competition in this space as these batteries move away from liquid electrolytes. And also we could end up with much lighter batteries as well, which then has a carryover to the electric vehicle space and better fuel efficiency equivalency. And now we're also seeing in some places, like in Hawaii, where they have a lot of solar on the grid already, and they don't necessarily want to add more daytime solar production, we're seeing this solar plus battery storage system like what Tesla has put in with Hawaiian Electric Company on the island of Kauai. And what they did is they put in a 13 megawatt system that was paired with a 52 megawatt hour storage system. And the idea being that they could store all of the output that solar system had available during the middle of the day and then use that to treat the evening peak. And that's worked out pretty nicely for them. And you can see in 2016 the contribution from solar to meeting the loads. And then once they added in this solar storage system, you could see that solar storage combo taking off some of the evening peak as well, without contributing substantially to the middle of the day solar oversupply and whatnot. And so, I think HECO just invested into their second system like this, or started investing into it. So I typically take that as a sign that things are looking good. We can expect to see more of these.